Hey everybody, this is Jenny Clark with Solvability, and this is another session of Freedom Friday. And today what we've got is Thadd McBride from Bassberry Sims. So Bassberry Sims has supported me with our GovCon Summit. Every year we're doing it again in April, and people are signing up now at solvability.com GovCon Summit. And guess what? We've got nearly 90 people already registered. And that's a record for me to have it done this early in the game. So Thadd, what I'd love for you to do is introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit about doing business with what the changes that people need to be aware of doing business with China these days. Take it
Jenny,
away.
thanks. All right. Well, I will. Jenny, thank you very much. And everybody who's joining either now or watching the recording, I appreciate your making a little time to listen to this topic. As Jenny said, my name's Thadd McBride. I'm with the law firm of Bassberry and Sims in Washington, D.C. Nothing's really happened up here this week at all. Been pretty non-eventful, as usual. We could spend hours and hours talking about that, but I want to talk about China, and I want to talk about it in the context of international trade, which is my practice area, and specifically three key areas. One is export controls, both controls maintained by the Commerce Department and the State Department on different types of U.S. origin goods. The next is economic sanctions, which are controls really on financial transactions and export transactions, but more often than not services type transactions. And then I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the main U.S. law that prohibits bribery of foreign government officials. And I think all of these things kind of fall in a bucket of national security in different ways. They all are maintained and enforced in particular ways that are based on our view of China as a national security threat, our view of China as a threat to democracy and to the economic success of the United States. And because of, and I'll talk a little more about this in a minute, because of what an important trading partner China nonetheless is for the United States, the relationship is very tricky. For instance, we give a lot of advice to clients on thinking about business or doing business with Cuba or Iran. Even occasionally we'll get a question about North Korea, and it's very easy because we just say, no, you can't do it. And in the case of China, and the case of Russia, which is the other one I'd sort of put in the same category as China, but specifically with China, the answer is usually yes, perhaps, if you take these steps, if you get this license, if you ensure that your transaction partner is not going to get you in trouble. So it's a particularly tricky place to do business while also being really, really continually important to the US economy.
Well, Thadd, I'm so glad you brought that up, because what you're saying is there's at least three things you have to worry about. What I thought you were also going to talk about are the restrictions that are coming up about because we're now operating in the cloud and we don't know where everybody is.
That's true too. And that's part of the export control regime that the US Commerce Department in particular, also the State Department, but especially the Commerce Department maintains. There of course is the overlay of the trade war, which is really more around tariffs, mainly that we've imposed, although the Chinese have imposed a number of counter tariffs as well. There also are data security issues because China maintains a pretty robust data security landscape. So those things are certainly important to bear in mind as you're contemplating doing business in China. But on the regulatory side, when you are considering a new transaction with a new transaction partner, perhaps involving an agent or other local representative, the things that I want to talk about today are really kind of the key areas you need to focus on in terms of ensuring you're staying compliant with US law and, in the context, by the way, making smart commercial decisions.
Okay, well, go ahead and get started. So you're going to talk first about export controls.
Exactly. And so, as I mentioned, the primary export control regimes are those maintained by the Commerce Department, and that's really the main one that I'll talk about. And the second most important regime, probably, or at least the second kind of principal regime, is maintained by the State Department. Those are controls that exist on items that are considered to be defense articles or defense technology or defense services, things that were specifically designed or modified for a military purpose. And again, in this regard, China's kind of easy because the US has a pretty absolute arms embargo in place on China and has for a while. So you can potentially get a specific authorization from the US government to export defense articles to China, but it is very unlikely. And this is something, for instance, that got Pratt & Whitney in a lot of trouble about 8 or 10 years ago because one of their non-US subsidiaries was actually sharing a decent amount of US origin technical data related to, I believe it was related to a military helicopter, it may have been a military engine. I think it was a military engine actually. In any event, shared a lot of controlled technical data with the Chinese. And as a result, Pratt & Whitney and then United Technologies Corporation, its owner in general, was forced to pay a very significant penalty to the US government, forced to put in place what's called a compliance monitor who has to kind of oversee everything you're doing in the way of getting export licenses and entering into business agreements. So doing business in the defense space with China, as I said, is prohibited, and the penalties for violating those prohibitions are pretty significant. So I want to focus more on the Commerce Department side, and these are the controls that are in place on the everyday items we all have around our house and that we use in our office, and sometimes on more tightly controlled and more sensitive things for which a license may be needed for export to China. Now, most everyday items can be exported to China without any sort of license, but there are some restrictions. And during the last 18 months of the Trump administration, the restrictions have been extended to cover a number of designated Chinese military end uses and end users. So this is a little different than the controls, the absolute arms embargo that exists on defense articles. These are commercial items that otherwise would be permissible for export to China that are now restricted when the export is made to a military end use or a military end user. And the important thing I want to note here is military end user is very broadly defined. So it's not just the Chinese military, it's the Chinese National Police Force, it's the Chinese Coast Guard, it's basically anybody that's doing anything with the item you've exported to them in support of the Chinese military. So the restrictions are a little broader, and the licensing requirements, therefore, are a little broader than you might otherwise expect.
I think what's so odd about it is how would you know all of these things? It's like, okay, I might think it's safe to sell to the Coast Guard in China, but how do I know they're not just going to give it to the Chinese military?
It's a good question. And one of the things I kind of want to weave throughout this and also focus on a little more towards the end of this session is best practices for complying with the restrictions, but certainly a critical component of doing business in and with China right now is doing robust due diligence on your transaction partner, on the nature of the transaction, making sure you know all the parties that'll be involved, including any distributors, any third parties, any freight forwarders, customs brokers, other things like that, to make sure both that those parties themselves aren't prohibited, but also that they're not likely to do anything that's going to get you in trouble. And again, I'll talk about a few more sort of specific strategies as we get towards the end of the program. The next area I wanted to focus on is economic sanctions. And these are the controls that are maintained by the US Treasury Department, an agency within Treasury called the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. And the sanctions run the gamut. The sanctions that the US government maintains runs the gamut. So I mentioned before Cuba, Iran, North Korea. These are countries against which we maintain pretty strict embargoes. Where there's very little you can do with one of those countries without a specific license from the government. China and Russia, as I mentioned, but China falls into a little trickier category where most Chinese end users and most Chinese parties that you do business with are permissible. But there are an increasing number of Chinese entities and individuals that have been designated under US sanctions, and therefore you either are restricted when doing business with them or just outright prohibited. So for instance, There are outright prohibitions on doing business with anybody that has been designated by the Treasury Department as having been involved in suppressing democracy in Hong Kong. There are absolute prohibitions on doing business with any party designated by the Treasury Department that has been involved in human rights violations in connection with the Xinjiang region of China. This is where the Uyghur population exists and where there's widespread reporting that those persons, those Uyghurs, have been sent to internment camps and otherwise that their human rights have been harmed. So you might be doing business with somebody who appears on their face in China to be entirely innocuous, only to discover when you go through the diligence process that the person is in fact a restricted party by the US government.
And is there a master list of those companies, or how do you find that out?
So I love these questions, Jenny, because the answer to almost all of them is you call your lawyer, which is very, very self-serving answer for me. And again, I'll share some more kind of specifics about how to address diligence. But the U.S. government does maintain lists of these prohibited parties that are fairly easy to check. A lot of larger companies have software solutions just because of the number of transactions and transaction partners that they have. They have software solutions that they use to screen potential business partners against these lists. But the US government does maintain these lists and they are publicly available. And then the last area I just want to focus on is anti-corruption. And this, of course, is not specific to China. Anybody that does business internationally, especially in the developing world, be it elsewhere in Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, Eastern Europe, really almost everywhere in the world outside the United States and Europe and a few of the kind of NATO and Japan, Australia, South Korea, the corruption continues to be a real issue. And the US government, especially the US Justice Department, enforces its anti-corruption law really, really aggressively. There have been huge penalties paid into the hundreds of millions of dollars, even into the billions of dollars for violations of US anti-corruption law. And frankly, a lot of those violations have involved bribery, corruption in China, because the law is focused on payments and offers of payments, but also gifts, providing lavish hospitality, entertainment, that sort of thing. The law is focused on provision of those things to government officials. And of course, because of how far reaching the Communist Party is and the state generally is in China, even seemingly commercial organizations or commercial enterprises that we would consider to just be commercial partners here in the United States may be owned or controlled by the government of China, in which case every employee of that entity is considered to be a government official for purposes of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So a lavish gift made to your counterpart at a Chinese state-owned company, even if given around the holidays or seemingly given for sort of an innocuous reason to live up to cultural standards, even that sort of gift can lead to issues under the FCPA.
We've got
Go
a
ahead,
question.
Jenny.
We've got a question in the chat room from my buddy Russ Barnes. So Russ, how about you just pop out tell him what your question is.
As you were describing the items that were on the commercial or restricted by on the commercial side, it just kind of occurred to me that you have people out there who are doing looking to do business and sell something to the military, but it's not of a combat nature, or it's not even of a technology security nature, where they're going to be giving technology that the Chinese don't necessarily have already. And in that situation, do those types of things, is it like everything? So if I had a first aid kit, if I had a first aid kit and I wanted to sell it to the Chinese and they were going to use it in the for the military, would that be restricted?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, it would depend a little bit on the ultimate use of the item, but I think the answer is yes. And it's a really good question, Russ, and we get this question all the time with respect to sales to the US military, There are, of course, lots of things like first aid kits, printers, computers, desks, tables, all sorts of things that the
Right.
military buys that are commercial in nature. And the fact that they're being purchased by the US military doesn't mean that they're subject to some sort of tighter control, at least for US export purposes. But at least with respect to the Chinese military, the answer is because it's a Chinese military end user, then the restrictions are very, very significant.
Well, Thadd, the more you talk, the more I understand why you have to call the lawyer. Why I need you on, because I'm thinking about companies that are a prime contractor or a subcontractor, and they're doing any kind of equipment activities. A lot of times we're trying to encourage small businesses to be selling products around the world, and they could run into problems with doing that by just not having the information they need to know it. And the other thing I'm thinking about is half the stuff we buy is made in China.
Right, right. Well, so that's when goods are coming into the country, and that's what, again, we could spend hours talking about whether the tariffs were effective or not, or will be effective. There is, as people may know, there's a really large lawsuit right now challenging the constitutionality of the tariff. So it's possible that they're all going to be rolled back before too long in any event. And I do want to comment a little bit on what I think the new administration is likely to do with respect to China, and I'll do that in a moment. But for the most part, what we have tried to do with the tariffs, or what the administration, I should say, has tried to do with the tariffs, is just drive manufacturing back to the United States, or at least to places that we consider to be friendlier and less of a national security threat than China. I don't know how effective that has ultimately been, just because supply chains are so well established and the Chinese have become so effective over the last 10, 15 years in terms of manufacturing, not only cheap things, but high quality things as well. So I don't think we're going to be able to completely, and I don't think we should completely sever ourselves from China. It's ultimately, even if tricky, from my perspective, too important a relationship for the good of the world economy, for the good of world peace, for the good of the climate, those sort of things. And so on to what the current administration may do. I think the current administration may take steps to look for more areas where the US and China can cooperate, recognizing that there continues to be a pretty significant power struggle in a lot of areas where we don't agree. But I think the current administration is likely to look for some areas of cooperation. That said, there really seems to have been a shift over the past 2 or 3 years, such that both parties now, I think, do view China as a threat. The scale of that threat, I think, differs a little bit depending on which side of the aisle you're on and your particular political persuasion. But I think the Democrats, as much as the Republicans, view China as a real threat. And so I don't expect things to be rolled back overnight. Far from it. I think most of the restrictions that the current administration has put in place will probably remain in place for the time being.
Well, that makes great sense. What I think of is the economic side of all of this. There's a book that came out several years ago called The Unstoppables. And actually the author came to my GovCon summit several years ago, and he was talking about the speed of the growth of the Chinese economy compared to the US economy, and how much debt is held by China. And so if we don't know it, pretty soon our greatest control will be economic, where China holds all our notes.
Yeah, I don't profess to be an economist. I've certainly heard that same thing said to me, and I've read articles where people express great worry about it and others that are very relaxed about it. But that kind of goes to my point about how interconnected we are with China. There's just no way that we're going to be able to, for instance, put in place the kind of sanctions that we have on Iran or Cuba or against China, because it's just too important a relationship, even if very, very tricky. And so in light of that, maybe this is a good segue into just kind of focusing on how to manage the the relationship and how to continue to do business with China or pursue business with China is that you just have to proceed carefully and be very vigilant. When you are entering into a transaction, you really need to understand what, if you're going to be exporting a product, how that product is classified. Is it considered to be, as is probably the case, is it considered to be a commercial item that's subject Commerce Department to control, or is it going to be considered a military item subject to State Department control, in which case it almost certainly won't be able to be sent to China. You need to understand who your end user is in China. Again, not only kind of the intermediate recipient of a product, be it a distributor or a freight forwarder, but also where the product is ultimately going to go. And then to one of your earlier points, Jenny, increasingly we're advising our clients, and I think the government's expecting companies to get end user certifications from Chinese companies that they certify that they're not going to be using the product for a military end use or transferring it to a military end user. Now, of course, that sort of certificate is really only as good as the paper that's written on, but it's better than nothing. And it suggests, if the US government were ever to come knock on your door and ask why you shipped something to China that got sent to a military end user, it suggests that you at least tried to dig into the facts a little bit and do due diligence on the transaction partner, how it was going to all play out. The other thing sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that it's interesting that people are talking about sometimes doing the compliance doesn't really solve the problem. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about, is how do you really know?
Exactly. You can never know. And so what we tend to say to companies is sort of twofold. One is that it is your best defense to have a fulsome compliance due diligence folder that demonstrates that you really understood the potential risks and that you did what you could to address them before entering into the transaction. So that even if things do go off the rails and the US government asks you about it and knocks on your door, you have something that you can present to the government and say, look, government, we didn't know this was going to happen. And frankly, we didn't even have reason to know it was going to happen. We didn't have any suspicion it was going to happen because everything came up roses when we did our diligence. And that's not an absolute defense, but it is definitely your best defense. And it's something that I think the government, we've certainly seen this many, many times, the government looks at pretty favorably. The other thing that we say, and this isn't really even kind of a legal point, but think about all of your own businesses. I think about this in my own business. We don't want to do business with disreputable business partners, both because they could get us in trouble. They might not pay us. They might pay us very, very belatedly. All those, they may go out of business, all those sort of things. And so there's a real commercial benefit too, of course, to doing the appropriate due diligence before engaging in a transaction, because once you do that diligence and once you determine that you have a bona fide business partner that you're going to be able to conduct the transaction with, you have that much more confidence that the transaction is actually going to happen as expected. You're going to be paid on a timely basis. And then, of course, hopefully going forward, it's a relationship that endures.
Well, I can see where that would make a big difference. And I think we've talked about due diligence with everything these days, whether it was companies coping with the changes under COVID and how they handle their employees and the PPP loans, all of that. I've been hearing the main thing to do is make sure you're working closely with a law firm and that you're documenting what your thoughts were at that point in time when you were doing what you felt was the right thing to do under advice from advisors like a law firm like Bassbury Sims. And what I think is so important about what you're talking about is the complexity of all this and how we as individual business owners make decisions. So Thadd, I'd love for you to just kind of sum up what your main advice for people is if they are doing business with China. I guess number one is talk to you first, right?
Well, yeah, certainly we do a lot of work with companies that are investigating business in China, doing business actively, including that have a presence in China. So we're very familiar with the risks. I was on a phone call last night, actually, with a lawyer in China who splits his time between China and Singapore. So we work closely as needed with counsel there because they they understand some of the local rules, regulations that of course we don't know, or at least we're not as familiar with. And so that's a piece of it too. Getting counsel there can be really valuable. But I think what you said a moment ago, Jenny, is the message I want to leave people with, which is just the importance of doing diligence and the importance of recognizing how challenging this business is, but also that it is manageable when you review transactions, you review partners carefully and thoughtfully. And frankly, that's something you should do when doing any international business, but it's particularly the case with China, just given the number of regulations. And then a point I think that's sort of been implicit in what I've been saying, and also in what you said, is the importance of keeping good records of the steps you've taken. Because it's one thing to tell the government 3 years after the fact, when a transaction kind of goes awry, that you took all these steps, but not be able to provide any documentary evidence of it. It's entirely different and much better, as you'd imagine, to be able to present them with this nice file with a red bow on it that shows all the steps that were kind of recorded contemporaneously.
Well, I think it's going to be very interesting to see where all this goes, but it really proves my point with what we've been doing with GovCon Summit in our federal contracting to support small businesses. We're talking about relationships. Everything that we're doing is you have to have a relationship with somebody that knows what they're doing, because they'll have somebody else. Because I'm not going to call an attorney in China and try to figure it out. If anyone that's moving forward in federal contracting or in the defense market in general really needs to be looking at a select group of people that they're willing to work with, that they have the trust with, that have the reputation to protect them. And that's why I've always enjoyed working with Bass-Berry Sims, because it's given me such confidence when I do have a question, knowing that when I refer somebody in there, they're going to get a full and complete answer and get the guidance that they really need. So thank you so much for being on today, Thadd. What I'd love to do is get you to give your contact information in case anybody wants to get in touch with you.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Jenny, for having us. We always like doing these programs. Thanks to everybody for joining. As I said, I'm in our DC office. So although I'm in theory in our DC office, I haven't actually been to the office in about 9 months. So the best way to reach me is on my cell phone, which is 202-253-2518, 202-253-2518, or email, of course, T McBride. So my first initial and my last name, all one word, at bassberry.com.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Or the other thing they can always do is call me and I'll connect them. That's usually what people are doing. So thanks so much. And just wanted to mention to everybody that we've got GovCon Summit coming up. I've got people registered. We're going to have a big thing. And what's different this year is we've really created a virtual accelerator network, so that if you come into GovCon, it's the mall, and we've got anchor stores, we've got specialty stores, we've got pop-ups, we've got the food court, anything everybody wants to do. My goal is to bring them through GovCon Summit and say, whatever you need, we're going to find it for you. So thanks, everybody. And by the way, the registration at solvability.com/GovCon Summit. And thanks, everybody, for being on. And everybody have a great weekend.